The Celestial Surveyor had been, up until approximately 47 minutes ago, a perfectly functional research vessel capable of supporting 12 crew members across 14 different biomes without so much as a hiccup in the atmospheric regulators. Now it was a smoking wreck embedded in the canopy of a jungle so aggressively verdant that the local flora had already begun attempting to digest the hull plating. The planet designated ZK-447 in the charts, though nobody had bothered giving it a proper name because who names a death trap had seemed perfectly safe from orbit. Lush vegetation, stable atmosphere, no obvious predators large enough to register on thermal scans. What the scans hadn't mentioned was the electromagnetic field that played merry hell with navigation systems, or the tree trunks with the approximate density of reinforced titanium, or the fact that every single plant within a 100-kilometer radius was producing enough toxic alkaloids to make a chemistry professor weep with professional admiration. The crew had survived the crash. That was the good news. The bad news was extensive enough to require subcategories. Thorn Valaxis, the extern captain, stood amid the wreckage of what used to be the cargo bay, his 6 fingers tapping an irritated rhythm against his thigh. The emergency supplies, 3 months' worth of standardized nutrition blocks, carefully formulated to meet the dietary requirements of every species on board, were buried under a collapsed bulkhead and thoroughly contaminated with hydraulic fluid. The fluid itself was rated food safe by 17 different galactic standards, but those standards didn't account for it being mixed with insulation foam, coolant, and what appeared to be part of the waste reclamation system. So, Mac Hendricks said, surveying the toxic soup with the kind of expression usually reserved for mildly disappointing restaurant meals. "We're not eating that." An astute observation, Quilmara replied, her translator rendering the Vespan's clicking mandibles into words dripping with sarcasm. The science officer was running her scanning equipment over a sample of the local vegetation, and the readout was painting itself an increasingly alarming shade of red. The indigenous flora contains sufficient neurotoxins to induce paralysis in most carbon-based life forms. The root systems concentrate heavy metals at levels that would be considered hazardous waste on 73 different homeworlds. Even the water absorbed by these plants carries microbial contaminants that our medical supplies are not equipped to handle. Brexfontaine, whose species had evolved on a planet where spicy meant capable of melting through hull plating, examined his own scanner and let out a hiss of agreement. The engineer in me appreciates the chemical efficiency. The part of me that enjoys living does not. Dizine, the ship's medic, was already calculating survival times with the grim precision of someone who'd seen too many emergency situations go from bad to catastrophic. We have emergency rations in the individual survival kits. Distributed properly, that gives us approximately 6 standard days before nutritional deficiency begins affecting cognitive function. 12 days before mobility is compromised. Rescue beacon is functional, but our position is off the established navigation routes. Estimated response time is somewhere between 3 weeks and never. So we're looking at a slow, hungry death while surrounded by abundant plant life that wants to kill us in faster, more interesting ways, Mac summarized. Anyone else see the irony here? Or is that just a human thing? Thorne's translator didn't quite capture the sigh, but the slump of his shoulders transcended linguistic barriers. The situation is suboptimal. That's one way to put it. The crew meeting that followed had all the hallmarks of a wake, minus the fond reminiscing, and plus a lot more mathematical projections of organ failure. Each species represented on the crew took their turn explaining, in technical detail, exactly why the local ecosystem was incompatible with their biological needs. The X-strands required specific amino acid chains that these plants didn't produce. The Vespens needed silicon-based compounds that were entirely absent. Brext's species could technically metabolize almost anything, but the specific combination of toxins here would crystallize in their secondary liver, which sounded unpleasant even by the standards of horrible ways to die. Mac listened to all of this with the attentive expression of someone at a lecture about paint drying techniques. Occasionally they'd ask questions, what about heat treatment? Or have you tested pH changes? Or did you check the underground root systems? That were met with the kind of patient condescension usually reserved for children asking why they couldn't breathe underwater. The toxins are heat stable, Quilmar explained, as one might explain basic physics to a particularly slow student. Thermal processing would not eliminate the danger. And the alkaloids, those break down at what temperature? It's not simply about temperature. The science officer continued, her mandibles clicking in what might have been the Vespen equivalent of an eye roll. These are complex organic compounds with multiple bonding structures. You can't just cook away poison. Right. Complex organic compounds. Got it. Max stood up, brushing debris off their uniform. Well, I'm going to go look around anyway. You know, just in case there's something we missed. We have performed comprehensive analysis, Quilmara said, waving a manipulator at her equipment. Our instruments are rated to detect nutritional compounds at the molecular level across a spectrum of, yeah, super impressive. I'm still gonna go poke around in the dirt like an idiot. Human prerogative. Thorne made a gesture that his species used to indicate resigned acceptance of inevitable stupidity. Do not stray far from the crash site. We lack the resources to mount a rescue operation for individual crew members. Touching concern, noted Captain. The jungle outside the ship's broken hull was the kind of aggressively alive that made sensible species nervous. Everything grew in competition with everything else. Vines strangling trees, strangling smaller vines in an endless cycle of botanical warfare. The air was thick with moisture and the smell of decomposition and growth happening simultaneously. Somewhere in the canopy, something screeched. Something else answered. Neither sound was reassuring. Mac ignored all of this with the practiced ease of someone whose species had spent millennia making homes in places that actively wanted them dead. They'd grabbed a salvaged pack, a basic cutting tool, and a portable scanner that was definitely not rated for botanical surveys, but would do in a pinch. The narrator should note here that humans possessed certain evolutionary advantages that served them well in survival situations. Millennia of eating questionable items had gifted them with remarkably resilient digestive systems. Their pattern recognition abilities, while not as precise as a Vespen's computational skills, excelled at making intuitive leaps from incomplete data. And perhaps most importantly, they had a survival instinct that manifested not as fear-based paralysis, but as stubborn refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat was statistically probable. Also, they were really good at figuring out what not to eat by eating small amounts of it and seeing what happened. This was not a survival strategy recommended by any reputable xenobiologist, but it had worked for long enough that humans kept doing it anyway. Mac started with the obvious candidates: root systems. Anything growing underground was putting energy into storage, which meant carbohydrates, which meant potential calories. They dug around the base of several different plants, noting which ones had thick tubers versus thin runners, which ones smelled sharply chemical versus earthily neutral, which ones left residue on their gloves versus wiping clean. Back at the ship, Quilmara was monitoring the humans' vital signs remotely, expecting at any moment to see the telltale spike that indicated toxic exposure. Instead, Mac's readings remained stubbornly normal as they collected samples with what appeared to be entirely arbitrary criteria. "They're sniffing them," she reported to the others, mandibles twitching with disbelief. "Literally putting the samples near their olfactory sensors and inhaling. Primitive chemical analysis." Brex observed. "Inefficient but functional, I suppose." What the aliens didn't understand, couldn't understand without humanity's specific evolutionary context, was that Mac wasn't being arbitrary at all. The sharp chemical smell, likely volatile compounds that would break down with heat, the slimy texture, mucilage that indicated water storage, useful for processing, the slight numbness after touching one variety. Definitely something to approach carefully, but numbness wasn't the same as tissue death, which meant sublethal doses were possible, which meant potential treatment methods existed. Mac hauled their collection back to the ship, several varieties of tubers, some bark from a tree that smelled promisingly bland, a handful of seed pods that rattled interestingly, and what looked like it might be some kind of fungal growth that was either going to be perfectly edible or kill them instantly. 50-50 odds were better than certain starvation. The aliens watched with mounting horror as Mac set up a makeshift processing station using a salvaged heating element, some containers from the medical bay, and what appeared to be a systematic plan despite all evidence suggesting otherwise. "Okay," Mac said, more to themselves than their audience. "First things first, leaching." They sliced the tubers thin, surface area was key, and dropped them into a container of water. The water immediately began taking on a yellowish tinge as compounds leached out of the plant matter. "You're diluting the toxins into the water," Quilmara observed. "This merely distributes the danger rather than eliminating it." "Yep. That's why we're gonna drain this, refill it, and repeat about 6 times. Mac was already moving on to the next batch, peeling the outer layers off another tuber variety. "See how this one's got the purple striping? That's anthocyanin, antioxidant. Probably means the plant's dealing with some kind of environmental stress, but the compound itself is harmless. The bitter taste, though, that's the alkaloids. Those are water-soluble, most of them anyway." The narrator would like to point out that Mac was absolutely making some of this up as they went along. However, they were making it up based on principles that had worked for humans on dozens of different planets, in hundreds of different survival situations, using nothing but stubbornness and a willingness to have mild gastrointestinal distress in the name of not starving. Hours passed. The water in Mac's leaching containers went through multiple cycles, each one coming out clearer than the last. The tubers that had started out bitter enough to make eyes water were now merely unpleasant. Progress. Next came heat treatment. Mac roasted some of the leached tubers over the heating element, watching how they changed color and texture. The Maillard reaction, that beautiful bit of chemistry where heat transformed sugars and amino acids into entirely new compounds, was working its magic. What had been toxic and inedible was becoming merely unappetizing. "The cellular structure is breaking down," Dizine observed, scanners active. "But the toxic compounds are breaking down too," Mac finished. "Not all of them, but enough. See, the thing about plant toxins is that they're usually there to prevent exactly this kind of thing, being eaten. But they're organic compounds, which means they're subject to all the same rules as any other organic compound. Heat them enough, they denature. Soak them enough, they dissolve. Process them right, and you get from deadly poison to won't kill you to actually kind of edible. The bark went into water to boil. Tannins needed heat and time to break down, but once they did, you were left with fiber and starch. The seed pods got roasted until they popped, revealing inner kernels that smelled promisingly nutty once the outer coating burned away. The fungus, well, that one was going to require a more careful approach. Mac set it aside for later, after they'd established that they weren't going to die from the more straightforward items. Quilmara's scanner was having an existential crisis. According to its readings, the compounds Mac was producing should still be toxic. Technically they were, but the concentration had dropped from definitely lethal to might cause mild discomfort, which in the grand spectrum of poison to food was a significant improvement. "I don't understand," she admitted, which for a science officer was roughly equivalent to a human admitting they'd seen a ghost. "The molecular analysis clearly indicates your scanner's looking for the presence of compounds," Mac interrupted, not unkindly. "It's not really set up to measure whether those compounds are present in quantities that actually matter. Yeah, there's still some alkaloids in here. There's alkaloids in potatoes too. Difference is dosage and preparation." By the time Mac announced that dinner was ready, the crew had gone from resigned acceptance of death to confused uncertainty about whether they were about to be poisoned by their own crew member. The spread laid out on a salvaged cargo container looked, well, it didn't look good. Exactly. But it looked like food, which was more than any of them had expected. "Right," Mac said, picking up what appeared to be a roasted tuber slice. "I'm going first, obviously. If I'm not dead in a few hours, you all can try it." They bit down, chewed thoughtfully, swallowed. The aliens waited. Mac took another bite. "Okay, so it tastes like slightly burnt dirt with hints of bitter regret, but I'm not immediately dying, which is a win." 3 hours later, Mac was still alive, still conscious, and actually looking somewhat satisfied. Their vital signs remained stable. No organ failure, no neurological symptoms, no indication of toxic exposure beyond what might be expected from eating something that tasted like the concept of disappointment. The human appears to have successfully rendered the local flora non-lethal, Dizine reported, as if narrating a nature documentary about particularly stupid animals that had survived through sheer luck. Thorne regarded the food with the expression of someone being asked to jump off a cliff on the promise that the fall probably wouldn't kill them. But hunger was a powerful motivator, and his emergency rations were already running low. He picked up a small piece of the processed tuber. It was, in his professional opinion, as someone who had eaten food on 17 different worlds, absolutely terrible. It had the texture of compressed sadness and tasted like water that had been filtered through regret. But it was edible. More than that, it was nutritious. His scanner confirmed it. Calories, carbohydrates, even some proteins from the seeds. Nothing that would win culinary awards, but everything needed to prevent starvation. One by one, the crew tried Mac's foraged meal. One by one, they came to the same conclusion: survival tasted awful, but it beat the alternative. "How did you know this would work?" Quilmara asked, still running scans, as if expecting the food to suddenly become toxic out of spite. Mac shrugged. "I didn't really, just seemed worth trying. Humans have been making food out of things that don't want to be food for a really long time. You'd be amazed what becomes edible with enough stubbornness and hot water." Over the following weeks, the crash site transformed from a scene of impending doom to something resembling a functional camp. Mac taught the others how to identify, process, and prepare the local flora. The lessons involved a lot of trial and error, several instances of mild poisoning, and one memorable incident where Brex accidentally created something that was technically alcohol and definitely not approved for consumption during work hours. They found varieties of roots that were naturally less toxic. They discovered that certain plants were edible only during specific growth stages. They learned that what they'd initially dismissed as inedible bark could be processed into a flour-like substance that made everything slightly less terrible to eat. The jungle that had seemed intent on killing them became, through sheer human stubbornness and culinary alchemy, a food source. When the rescue ship finally arrived, 6 weeks late, having had to recalibrate their navigation 3 times to account for the planet's electromagnetic interference, they found the crew not only alive, but actually looking reasonably healthy. The rescue captain, a Zethran-like thorn, surveyed the camp with visible confusion. "Your distress beacon indicated catastrophic supply failure," he said. "We expected to find survivors in critical condition." "We did have catastrophic supply failure," Thorn confirmed. "But we had a human." The rescue captain looked at Mac, who was currently pulling what appeared to be a roasted tuber out of a makeshift oven, and then back at Thorn. "I'm going to need that explained." "The human," Thorn said slowly, as if still processing the absurdity himself, turned the inedible jungle into food, using techniques that can best be described as deliberately primitive and scientifically questionable, but pragmatically effective. Quilmara held up her scanner. Every analysis confirmed the local flora was toxic. Every projection indicated certain death. The human ignored all of it and started boiling things until they weren't poisonous anymore. "It wasn't quite that simple," Mac interjected. "There was also roasting, leaching, fermentation in a couple cases, and a lot of hoping I wasn't about to die." The rescue captain made a note on his datapad. In the report he'd file later, there would be a new category added to human survival capabilities: unreasonably persistent in refusing to accept starvation as inevitable outcome. It wasn't the most scientific classification, but it was accurate. As the crew prepared to leave ZK-447 behind, Mac took one last look at the jungle that had almost killed them. The plants swayed in the breeze, still toxic, still dangerous, still absolutely not interested in being anyone's food source. They'd made it edible anyway. That, the narrator reflects, was the thing about humans that continued to baffle the rest of the galaxy. They looked at a universe that clearly stated, "You cannot eat this," and responded with "Watch me." They took impossibility as a personal challenge and stubbornness as a viable survival strategy. They turned poison into dinner through nothing but determination and a willingness to have really bad meals. Other species had better technology, superior analysis tools, more efficient digestive systems. Humans had the galaxy's most dangerous combination of traits: opposable thumbs, pattern recognition, and an absolute refusal to admit when they were beaten. The universe kept trying to kill them. They kept figuring out how to eat it instead. Somewhere in the galactic databases, ZK-447 would be marked with a new note: "Local flora successfully processed for consumption by human crew member. Recommended survival protocols updated to include Ask the Human as step 1. It wasn't the most dignified addition to humanity's reputation, but then again, dignity had never been their strong suit. Surviving through sheer bloody-mindedness, on the other hand, that was practically their species' motto. The Celestial Surveyor's replacement vessel jumped to FTL, leaving behind a planet that remained just as toxic as ever. But now it wore an invisible mark, a footnote in the cosmic ledger that would make future explorers pause and wonder. Humans had been there. They'd turned the inedible into sustenance, and somehow, against all reasonable expectations, they'd made it look almost easy.